All right, hey everyone. We are live, and I want to thank you for joining me on this segment that I'm calling Poking the Bear. And I want to explain what I mean by that, and then we'll get right into the topic for today. This was a realization that I had last week before going live. I came up with a t-shirt idea with some friends and family members, which said, "It's time to poke the bear." And what I meant by that was it's time to go to Washington, for us citizens to go to Washington, whether it's citizens that are elected into Congress or just simply citizens protesting or whatever, to go to Washington and sort of demand that they guarantee us our freedoms, guarantee us our elections with integrity, and guarantee us that they will start putting some fiscal restraints in place. And so, but I started thinking about it and seeing what's happening not only in the United States and the pushback that people are getting, the pushback that is happening in the terms of protests and groups that are rising up and getting ready for this next election, but also what we're seeing in Canada, the Freedom Convoy, and we're seeing that all around the world. In France, they had them, in Australia, and I think there's some other countries too. So the reality is that we are the bear. They poked us when they started infringing upon our medical freedoms and all of the things I mentioned earlier. So that's why I'm calling this Poking the Bear. And when I talk about my candidacy for Congress, I am starting to refer to myself as a citizen candidate, an outsider, a business owner, but I'm a citizen candidate. I like that terminology because really the idea, especially of the House of Representatives, meant to be candidates who were just plain regular citizens, business owners, people that would take time out of their life to go to serve in Washington for a few years, and that's exactly what I'm planning on doing. I am a conservative, and most conservatives would say that, what we're trying to do, what conservatives like to do is preserve our heritage, preserve our traditions, preserve our principles as a people and as a nation. And that's when we were at our best, is when we had certain principles that we followed and that we taught to the next generations. Amazing to watch. And so again, we're protecting these rights and these principles for future generations, and that's why I'm doing this. So that's what I mean by poking the bear. Before I get started again, I would like to encourage you to please consider supporting the campaign. You can go to the website winred.com, and from there you can look up my name. You can look up the state and then just scroll down into District 7 and find my name. I'm sure that you can also search for that. But it's a secure website that you can donate to the campaign. The donations are coming in pretty well right now, but certainly we're going to need more funds to complete the campaign. So I would just encourage you if you'd like to do that. So now let me get into today's subject, which is the Constitution. And now, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but I do have a brain and I do have eyeballs. And the Constitution was written in a way that we can all read it for ourselves, and we should. And quite frankly, I think that in schools, they're getting away from teaching the Constitution. Maybe in the AP classes they're teaching it, but certainly they don't spend as much time teaching the Constitution and things like that about how our government work as they do other unnecessary things. I'm getting messages here from Facebook, constantly wanting to give me messages, so I'm hoping that the quality is okay here. I don't have time to diagnose it though, so I'm just going to keep moving on. Like I said, I'm not a constitutional scholar. I do have a friend of mine who is who's an attorney who has special knowledge of the Constitution. So I do run these things by him before I come to conclusions or before I make statements, I do talk to them about these things to make sure what I call a sanity check. And so what I would define myself as a strict constitutionalist, and I would get that from my belief in being a strict follower of the Bible. When I want to know what the Bible says, I don't go ask somebody what they think the Bible says. I go to the Bible itself. Now, from there, you can get commentary, you can get opinions from other people about what specific language is. You can look at the original language that they wrote it in. But the reality is that the most place that I'm going to get my understanding of the Bible is from the Bible. And so I feel the same way about the Constitution. We can read it, we can see what it says, we can get opinions from other people about what it says, but I'm not interested in 225 years of people reinterpreting the same articles over and over and over again to the point where it doesn't mean anything about like what it originally meant. And so I'll talk in a minute about the First Amendment, but there's a quote that's out there about the Constitution that was attributed originally to Patrick Henry, but there's some question as to whether he said it, but it doesn't matter whether he said it or not. I think this is a great quote and a great description of how I think of the Constitution. The Constitution is not a document for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. And so I'll just say that's an anonymous quote, but I like it, and so I will use it. So for today, I want to talk the enumerated powers, which is in Article 1, Section 8. I want to talk about the First and Second Amendments, and then the 10th Amendment, which is, we'll talk about that as well. So the enumerated powers, I had posted about the enumerated powers, and it goes hand in hand with the quote that I just read. Government specific powers, and the powers that it doesn't give the federal government go. And so I'm not going to read it all right here, but really if you read through the enumerated powers, you'll see that mostly what it is, it talks about essentially coining money and levying taxes. It talks about sort of the war powers and a couple of other powers like the post office and about patents and things like that. But really the powers of the federal government are very limited. It also talks about regulating interstate commerce. So in reality, the way I see it and the way I've always seen it is two of the main functions of the federal government is to, one, protect the citizens, and I believe that also means protect the citizens from a tyrannical government. And number two, to regulate interstate commerce. The way that this country was built was upon commerce, and that's how we became great, was because of our innovations and because of our trade. And really, if the government would just focus on those two things, I think we'd be much better off. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution talks about these powers, and I would just encourage you to read through it. And also there's some summaries that you can find that sort of summarize it in more like today's language. So next I want to talk about the First and Second Amendment. And this one is the one that drives me crazy, because when you talk about the separation of church and state, the First Amendment, to the point where I actually have this one pretty much memorized. The First Amendment: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of. That's what the Constitution says about the freedom of religion. So when a kid gets up on stage at a commencement and says a prayer or mentions God in his commencement speech, the kid is neither a member of Congress, nor is he nor is he prohibiting the free speech or the free exercise of somebody else for their religion. So how where after 225 years or so, the language is now the separation of church and state. And this is what I mean by we need to teach the Constitution in school to these days as much as we teach some of these other things, such as, well, you know what I mean in terms of the social justice and whatnot. The Second Amendment, pretty simple. a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's pretty clear. There's nothing after that. It's that simple. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And you can make the argument that any law about gun control, even to the point of about having to have a license or anything like that, is an infringement of people's right to keep and bear arms. You could even argue that there's nothing here that says that that you have to have what do they call it, responsible gun ownership. And because that's a slippery slope, and I've talked about this before. I would say that I'm a constitutional carry advocate, and what I mean by that is, even these laws that make it so that you have to pass a background check, and that people who are unstable aren't allowed to own guns. Well, you could claim anybody's unstable, right? I mean, if someone was on depression medications 5 years ago, one time for a few months, somebody could point to that person and put them on some kind of a list that says they're not allowed to own guns ever in the future. So I think all of those things are an infringement on our rights, as our rights are stated here in the Constitution. So it's kind of fun to read the Constitution itself to see what it says. And I'm only going through this, and I'm trying to keep this short, but I really want people to understand where I'm coming from. And I'm coming from the position of being a strict constitutionalist. The 10th Amendment, and here's where it says, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. This is the amendment that basically says that reinforces the quote that I said earlier, which is that the Constitution is not a document to restrain the people. It's an instrument for the people to restrain the government. And I believe wholeheartedly in that. And my goal is to go to Washington and restore some of that. And I'm hoping that there's a red tidal wave of other representatives that come with me. And that's really what it's going to take in order to restore some sanity to our country. And you can, if you're watching this in the future and you want to ask questions about anything that I've said here, but by all means, feel free to make a comment, and I will do my best to answer it. Lastly, I want to talk about, if I'm elected, how does the Constitution apply to some of the issues that I have brought up, that I'm running on. And I'm running on really 3 key issues, and that's election integrity, medical freedom, and fiscal reform. I've been told that I should change the language from fiscal reform to maybe something like budget reform or spending reform, just to make the language a little more simple. But regardless, those are the 3 issues. All of those issues are sort of underlying by what I would call corruption and abuse of power. This country, the federal government is out of control right now, and the people in the federal government, the people that are, have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, are out of control. And so I want to talk a little bit about these 3 issues and how the Constitution applies to them. Okay, election integrity. First of all, I think that I'm in favor of constitutional amendment for to term limits for Congress, both the Senate and the House. And the funny thing is, this week, and I've been saying this for a while now, but this week I saw that Representative Cawthorn from, I believe, North Carolina, I saw an article on him trying to propose and initiate this momentum towards term limits, a constitutional amendment for term limits for Congress, the House and the Senate. And what he proposed is exactly what I had proposed previously, which is essentially 12 years, which would be 6 terms for Congress or for the House and 2 terms for the Senate. And his reasoning is the same as mine, which is that should be enough time to make an impact. Anything beyond like 12 years, you start to become just a career politician. And so I'm in favor of that. I'm also in favor of a balanced budget amendment. And I can talk more about that maybe at a future date, but I'll talk briefly about it today under my fiscal reform section. But let's talk about election integrity. I think that we do need some laws to strengthen corruption practices. In other words, corruption penalties. The fact that election corruption affects all the states, I think, is a problem. And I think that that is an area where Congress can and should get involved to essentially make it much worse of a felony. I think it's like a level 5 or whatever they call it, a level 5 felony right now. And it should be, I just think it should be, those laws should be strengthened so that anybody caught tampering with elections, and that can be delineated. One person, voting for their grandmother on behalf of their grandmother, even though that's not legal, I don't think they should be thrown in jail. But certainly people who are doing ballot harvesting and ballot dumps, or messing with election equipment or election rolls or anything like that. I mean, you're talking about, it should be a minimum of 5 years jail time, I think, and certainly worth the debate. Here's the other thing when it comes to election integrity that I'd like to do if I'm elected, and that is I would like to question members of the executive and the judicial branch. The great thing about the way our Constitution is written is that we have co-equal branches of government. You got your legislative branch, which is what I'm running for. You got your executive branch. They're supposed to execute the laws, not make up their own laws, not do it as they see fit. They're supposed to execute the laws that are passed. And then the judiciary is supposed to interpret the laws. And I think that there are a lot of questions that I have for both the executive branch, whether they're still there or not, and the judicial branch. I actually think that it would be appropriate to question potentially members of the Supreme Court in terms of why did they not take the Texas lawsuit that was filed. It seems to me, and I've read different opinions and I've heard opinions from different legal scholars, that they really were required to take that case because of the enormity of it and because of the fact that it was a dispute between states. That's exactly what they're there for. And so that's something that I would relish the opportunity to do, is to question members of the Supreme Court and also other members of the executive branch. Medical freedom. I want to talk briefly about the Constitution does not really mention sort of medical freedom. But again, we go back to this idea that anything not granted to the federal government, it doesn't have. So the federal government does not have the power to force us to get a vaccine or to force us to get any kind of medical procedure. All right, but what we do have is laws that we adhere to. One is an international law called the Nuremberg Code, and the second is a report called the Belmont Report, which was written to clarify a law that was passed in 1974, which I can't remember the name of right now, about medical experimentation. And I want to talk briefly about this Belmont Report because this is about our country. This is something that that Congress did pass, and it is part of our law. So anyhow, that's the Nuremberg Code. And if you want to Google it, you can just Google. You probably have to go to DuckDuckGo because if you go to Google and type in the Belmont Report, you're probably going to get a fact check about the Belmont Report. If you go and type the Nuremberg Code, you're probably going to get a fact check about the Nuremberg Code. All right, I don't have it in front of me here. I must have closed the tab. So I'm going to talk briefly about it. I did look it over before I came on the air here. But as far as the Belmont Report, there's basically 3 sections of it. The first section, the thing that I pulled out of there, is respect for persons. It's basically saying that people, that when we talk about medical experimentation, there should be respect for persons and there should be respect for people who can't make their own decisions. And to me, that means kids. People that can't make their own. We should not be experimenting on kids. And the reason why I consider it experimentation is because maybe you don't know this, but the Pfizer vaccine is the only one that is approved by the FDA. The Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines are not approved by the FDA, which means they're still considered experimental. They can call it phase 3 trials, but they're still experimental. And so to me, people are being experimented on. The second part of that is informed consent. There's a section in Section 3 of this Belmont report. There is specifically says informed consent, and I don't believe that we have informed consent right now. I believe that we have basically coercion. The third thing is volunteering, to do that. And so the Nuremberg where people were executed for medical experimentation during World War II. And I think these are serious violations and serious questions that's going on in our medical community right now. Now, as far as fiscal reform, again, as it applies to the Constitution, that's why I think we do need a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. $1 in debt. That's $1 trillion is a million. I don't think it's even fathomable how much debt we owe right now. And if someone said to me, well, it's not wise because we should have a budget where we can have deficit spending so that we can stimulate the economy, et cetera, I would just say that we have proven in this country, our representatives have proven, and our politicians have proven that they are not wise. They need to be restrained. And we need a constitutional amendment that restrains them. And, like I said, I'm going to talk more about that in another Poking the Bear segment. I'm going to do a whole 15 minutes or 20 minutes on that topic. But one last thing I want to say about this constitutional amendment is I don't see how in the near future a constitutional amendment is going to pass the House and the Senate in the numbers that it needs to, in the percentages that it needs to, in order to get an amendment for a balanced budget or for term limits. So that's why I want to encourage people to look into the Convention of States. There's a Convention of States movement right now, and what that essentially does is goes around Congress to call a Convention of States where new amendments can be proposed and passed and ratified, and then they're sent to the states. The states still have to pass these amendments, but it bypasses Congress. And it was designed to essentially be able to rein in the control or the power that Congress has. And so I would encourage you to look into that. So again, I want to thank you for joining. I know I blasted through a lot of this stuff quickly. I wanted to essentially lay out my position on the Constitution itself and then how it affects some of my campaign positions.